Hello and welcome to the ACR Journals on Air podcast. I am your guest host, Bharat Kumar, filling in for Vicky Shamagan. Axial spondyloarthritis, AXPA, is an absolute beast of a disease. Like many of the conditions that we treat, it is a cause of intense pain and suffering. Luckily, we have more options than ever before to treat this condition. Today, we'll be talking about an emerging option for treating AXPA, intravenous Secukinumab. The manuscript that details this is Efficacy and Safety of Intravenous Secukinumab in Patients with Active Axial Spondyloarthritis, results from a randomized placebo-controlled phase 3 study. It was published in Arthritis and Rheumatology, and a link to the manuscript and disclosures are in our show notes for today. We are so grateful to be joined by the first author of this study, Dr. Atul Devdar. Atul Devdar is a professor of medicine and the medical director of the rheumatology clinics at the Division of Arthritis and Rheumatic Diseases in Oregon Health Science University, Portland. He is board certified in internal medicine and rheumatology and is a fellow of the American College of Rheumatology and also the American College of Physicians. Dr. Devdar is a past chair of Spartan, has served on the steering committee of GRAPPA, and has served in the American College of Rheumatology through various capacities, including being the vice chair of the annual meeting planning committee. Dr. Devdar is the editor-in-chief of Best Practice in Research Clinical Rheumatology. He has authored 3 books, over 300 peer-reviewed articles, several editorials, and many book chapters, including in Harrison's Textbook of Medicine. He has been the principal or co-investigator in more than 100 clinical trials, mostly focused on therapies for axial spondyloarthritis, psoriatic arthritis, and rheumatoid arthritis. So welcome, Dr. Devdar. And first of all, I wanted to thank you so much for writing and researching so extensively on this topic. Our knowledge of the pathophysiology, the diagnosis, and the management has grown so much over the past few years, and is really due to the passionate work that you've done in this. So as a young rheumatologist, I want to let you know that you are a huge inspiration for me. So please, take it away.
No, thank you. Thank you so much, Bharat. And it's refreshing for me to hear my real name, Devdar, which some people who are listening probably think, who is this person? So I'm known around in the US as Devdar, Dr. Duda, etc. But Devdar is the correct pronunciation, which is, I rarely hear it. But of course, people with the Indian tongue can say Devdar. So thank you for that kind introduction. And I'm delighted to get this opportunity to chat with you about our latest paper published in the Arthritis and Rheumatology in the February issue of this year of IV Secukinumab for axial spondyloarthritis. So what do you want to know? Should I give you a quick summary of it?
Yeah, so absolutely. Let's do something a little untraditional. Let's start from the end. If you can just summarize what your study showed in just 1 or 2 sentences, what would you tell the people?
IV Secukinumab at the dose of 6 milligram per kilogram as the starting dose and then 3 milligram per kilogram every 4 weeks works very well. And the safety of this molecule was not very different than what we see with subcutaneous secukinumab that we are all very used to using for axial spondyloarthritis and also for psoriatic disease. That would be my summary in 2 sentences.
Awesome. And so, AXPA tends to affect fairly young adults, and I'd like to honor that connection between the work that you do and the many people that stand to benefit from this work. By any chance, are you familiar with the concept of brain rot?
Brain rot. My wife has accused me or has diagnosed that in me many a times when I'm not able to find my socks or when I forget names. So I have heard it in that context, but I think you're not going to use it in that context. So no, apart from that, I've never heard of brain rot.
Well, brain rot has a lot of different contexts. There's a lot of different things, but right now it's kind of a slang for the young people who are online a lot. It was actually the word of the year in 2024. These are like the kind of TikTok kind of lingo. I'm not too familiar with it, but I decided that I was going to put your conclusion from your manuscript into the English to brain rot online translator to see what it would sound like. And here's what it would sound like to the TikTok generation. I apologize for any errors. I'm not fluent in brain rot. IV Secukinumab clapped AXPA for real over 52 weeks. The safety vibes match the past reports on subcutaneous Skibbity Secukinumab. So that's how it would sound like.
That is pretty similar to what I said, except it was a little bit slang. But and of course, I went into a little bit details. But yeah, so I think what I speak is like brain rot in a way. it it's pretty good.
It's kind of like you were saying about Devdutt versus Deodar, right?
That's right.
Different tongue.
Yeah.
So that was kind of like on the back end and a little bit of a detour into lingo. But let's get well to the front in the background section. So this part is certainly not brain rot, but it may sound like it to those who are pretty unfamiliar. So what is AXPA and R-AXPA and NR-AXPA, and why do these names matter?
Yeah, so you're right. I mean, the R-AXPA and NR-AXPA doesn't really matter in day-to-day practice, and this all changed by the 2009 classification criteria put forward by ASAS, the Assessment of Axial Spondyloarthritis International Society. By the way, these classification criteria are changing. Spartan, which is Spondyloarthritis Research and Treatment Network, and ASAS, we have done a large study called Classic, and the classification criteria, which were first put forward by ASAS in 2009, will be changed. It will be called ASAS Spartan Classification Criteria to 2025, and they are nearly ready. We have got two models and etc. But be as it may, ankylosing spondylitis was the original name for a disease. But then to call somebody to have ankylosing spondylitis, you needed definitive sacroiliitis. And the definition of definite sacroiliitis was bilateral grade 2 sacroiliitis or higher, like grade 3 and grade 4, etc. The problem with this is that if somebody develops the inflammatory back pain, a classical feature of axial spondyloarthritis, their x-rays are not going to change for years to come. And we were not able to diagnose these patients with ankylosing spondylitis, even though they had the disease. Things changed with the advent of MRI, and we could then start diagnosing patients early on, even before patients had any evidence of radiographic changes on their x-rays. And that's where the concept of non-radiographic came in, because we wanted to find patients early and treat them early and not wait for 6 years, 10 years till the x-rays change. Having said that, this non-radiographic and radiographic should really be left for clinical trials. In day-to-day practice, I tell my patients, you have got axial spondyloarthritis, what we used to call ankylosing spondylitis. And in fact, I use it to the advantage, sort of to give a good news to the patient. Hey, we caught you early. You don't have these X-ray changes yet. We are catching you early. Patients love it. So that's the only when I kind of tell them this is non-radiographic. This is not really, we caught this early. This is not the ankylosing spondylitis that you heard about. So apart from that, in day-to-day practice, it doesn't matter whether it is non-radiographic or radiographic. The treatment is the same. And the second quick point is the grading is devised by rheumatologists. Our musculoskeletal radiologists don't read rheumatology journals, just like we don't read radiology journals, and they don't know what these gradings are. And if you think about sharp score in rheumatoid arthritis, radiologists don't know about sharp scores. That is Dr. Sharp who devised that in rheumatology. And Vander Heidi Desiree, friend of mine, she is a rheumatologist. So Vander Heidi sharp scores, I mean, all of these are devised within rheumatology. The MSAS score, I mean, that's also developed in rheumatology. Be as it may. So the grading of sacroiliitis, they don't grade this. And plus, if you give the same X-ray to two different radiologists, trained radiologists, you'll need a third one, because the grading is kind of very arbitrary. In other words, radiographic, non-radiographic is arbitrary. Don't use it in clinical practice. You might use it to tell your patient, no, we caught it early. But beyond that, doesn't matter in day-to-day practice. It's only for FDA reasons and for clinical trials and etc.
Great. That's really helpful for me as a practicing rheumatologist. And I did want to mention parenthetically, I would recommend that if there are any radiologists that are listening to this podcast, please read the ACR journals. We want you to read them, please. Also, the other thing I noticed in your responses, you mentioned this phrase quite a bit, caught you early, right? You mentioned at least 2 or 3 times, and you've been at the forefront of this. So what are the options out there to help treat patients who have AXPA, especially those who have been caught early?
Yeah. So unlike rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis. Our classic conventional synthetic DMARDs like sulfasalazine and methotrexate and leflunomide and etc., hydroxychloroquine, they strangely have zero effect on the axial skeleton. There is something different about axial skeleton compared to peripheral skeleton. I have searched far and wide and haven't really come with a good conclusion. Maybe that there is something to do with synovitis versus osteitis and enthesitis. In other words, in rheumatoid arthritis and even in rheumatoid arthritis, the predominant pathological lesion is synovitis, whereas here in spondyloarthritis, it is predominant lesion, at least in axial SPA, is osteitis, and then enthesitis, on which methotrexate and other drugs do not work. And because of that, our treatment options are very limited. So, from non steroidal anti inflammatory drugs, and of course, physical therapy and exercise, we jump straight to biologics. There again, we have only two choices in biologics, which is the TNF inhibitors and IL-17 inhibitors, and one choice in the targeted synthetic DMARD like the JAK inhibitors. So, total three choices classes compared to multiple choices in rheumatoid arthritis and psoriatic arthritis, also multiple choices, etc. So it's a limited armamentarium that we have, which also brings to this particular paper that we are discussing today. Then we need to use this as much as we can, our limited arsenal, to treat our patients early so as to give them better chance feeling better and their quality of life improvement and functional improvement and etc etc. And you raise a very good point, Bharat, that these are young people. This disease starts in the second decade of life, generally 18, 19, and then certainly by third decade, when they're 26, 27, 28, people have had this. So these are the main years in their life that they're working, and it affects them quite adversely. So early treatment is extraordinarily important.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And, that's why I wanted to talk more about Invigorate 1. And by the way, that is a great name for a trial. There's no false advertising in that whatsoever. When I read your article, I really did leave feeling very reinvigorated. So please tell us, and you can go into all the nerdy details that you'd like. What did you do to test what you wanted to find out?
So, I mean, this might be an anticlimax, but Secukinumab works. We know this anyway. I participated in multiple studies on Secukinumab from measure 1 and measure 2, and they did measure 1, measure 2, measure 3, measure 4, up to measure 5. And measure 1, measure 2 were published back in New England Journal of Medicine, I think 2017 or 2016 or something like that. And in measure 1, we used IV Secukinumab as a loading bolus, 6 milligram per kilogram and then 3 milligram. So I think it was 6 milligram per kilogram day one and second week and fourth week. And then we went on to later on, patients went on to subcutaneous. So we all know Secukinumab works. It's already approved by the FDA. IV should work. The reason to do this trial was to give patients a choice. That's number one. Some patients are afraid of taking injections. And the second more important thing is that strangely, insurance companies, some of them, namely Medicare, it's a so we already spoke about limited choices. And for Medicare patients, IV drugs are cheaper, out of pocket expense is cheaper. But then already we have got limited choices. So then the only IV drugs we had for axial spondyloarthritis were IV infliximab and IV golimumab. Beyond that, we didn't have anything. So this was another reason that we wanted to expand the choices to patients in the US. And by the way, this drug is only approved in the US, not by EMA. IV Secukinumab. The trial was purely done in the US, exactly for the same reason that here we need more choices for our patients who cannot really get injectable drugs because of the quirkiness of their insurances.
Yeah, quirkiness is certainly one way to put a description for insurance company. So, I was reading this and I found a term there that I had not heard before. And this may be getting a little bit into the weeds, but tell me, what is this interactive response technology? It was used for random.
Yeah, so these are multi-center studies. So you have heard, of course, randomization. Now, how does randomization occur? And that occurs by a computer system. And so this term that you're talking about, it just basically says that when I see a patient for my clinical trial, I enter it into, so now it is web based. Previously, it used to be voice based. So I would actually call a number. This is probably 15 years ago when I used to do a trial and I had limited research assistants working with me. And I would then pick up the phone myself and I have a patient in front of me and I would call this number. And it was voice adjusted system. The computer at the other end would kind of give you a specific number to the patient, whatever the number was. And then I would transmit that number to my research pharmacy. And then they would say, okay, this is patient number 183. So then they would pull out a box and send it to me to give it to the patient. And this is how it used to be done. So this system that you're asking me about, now it is web based. And basically, when you enter this into the computer, it gives this number. It is used for randomization. It is used for creating this unique identity to the patient. It goes to the drug supply. It goes to logistics. And so basically, it's a system which is used all around the world for doing multi-center, multinational clinical trials to randomize people and get the correct drug to the correct patient in the correct place.
Well, that's pretty neat. I mean, the devil is always in the details when it comes to these kind of things. Can you tell us about the arms of the Invigorate-1 trial a little bit?
Yeah, so this was a trial on axial spondyloarthritis, the whole group. We did not divide the patients into non-radiographic and radiographic. And in a way, we are trying to train the FDA to give up this idea about doing that specific or separate trials for ankylosing spondylitis and non-radiographic axial SPA. So these were patients who had axial spondyloarthritis, either ankylosing spondylitis or non-radiographic. And of course, patients who participate in the clinical trial after diagnosis have to fulfill the classification criteria. So the study was randomized 526 patients. Half of them were randomized to IV Secukinumab, 6 milligram per kilogram loading dose only once, and then 3 milligram per kilogram every 4 weeks thereafter. And equal number, 262 patients on placebo infusion, and the primary endpoint was at week 16. So those were the two groups, 1:1 randomization, IV Secukinumab versus placebo. Very clean and simple design.
And that's pretty neat in terms of its cleanliness. Can you tell us a little bit about the primary endpoints?
Yeah, the primary endpoint for this study was ASAS-40 response, which is 40% improvement in some of the criteria. And of course, the listeners know about this. So the number was, and this was at week 16. And after week 16, patients who were on placebo started receiving IV Secukinumab. They did not receive that 6 milligram per kilogram loading dose. They straight went on to 3 milligram per kilogram IV every 4 weeks. And the primary endpoint was 41%, 40.9%, 41% on the active drug compared to 23% in the placebo. So this was statistically significant. So the IV Secukinumab 6 milligram per kilogram at baseline and then 3 milligram per kilogram every 4 weeks did meet the primary endpoint. And then, of course, patients continued on the same for up to week 52. But this is an open label extension. Everybody knows they're getting IV Secukinumab. And at the end of 52 weeks in open as observed data, it was about 75%, 65% patients, 65 to 75% patients had the ASAS-40 response.
Well, that's good to hear. And then in addition to this primary endpoint, which is ASAS-40, there were a bunch of secondary endpoints as well. Any comments on them? It's hard for me to parse through them.
Yeah, there are lots and lots of secondary endpoints. I mean, in axial spondyloarthritis, you need to know the patient's symptoms, which are most important for the patient. Quality of life, very important for the patient. Functionality, very important for the patient. And of course, disease activity, important for patient and for us as well. So the secondary endpoints are things like ASDAS, axial spondyloarthritis disease activity score. Then there is, of course, ASAS-20 responses. There is a partial remission, ASAS partial remission. And then there are these BATH. That's where I trained in England before I came to the US, where I got my interest started in axial spondyloarthritis. So the BASDAI, Bath Ankylosing Spondylitis Disease Activity Index, and Bath Ankylosing Spondylitis Functional Index. These are all very important ones. These are all our secondary endpoints. There is AS quality of life. And then SF36 physical component. This is a This is not a disease-specific measure. SF-36 is used in RA trials and PSA trials and all kinds of trials. It is agnostic of what the current underlying disease is. And then, of course, the high sensitivity CRP. So not just that the patient feels better, but are we dropping their inflammation? So all of these are the secondary endpoints. Some of them are binary, whether you get it or don't get it, like ASS partial remission. Some of them are continuous secondary endpoints. So there is a slew of endpoints that we looked at, and they were all statistically significantly better with IV secukinumab compared to placebo.
Awesome. Awesome. And then the other side of the coin is about safety. So, I'd seen a little bit about the treatment adverse effects. What kind of treatment adverse effects were you looking at, and what did you find?
Yeah. So we knew from our experience of subcutaneous secukinumab that there are certain adverse events of interest. And those are, number one is candida infection. IL-17, interleukin-17 is a cytokine that is somehow important for us to prevent fungal infections and mostly candida. And these are superficial, rather skin or oral mucosal infection, etc. In the original trials, none of the patients had systemic candidiasis, but candidiasis is an interesting sort of thing. So those are some specific ones. Inflammatory bowel disease is another one that we are concerned about with IL-17 inhibitors. But quite apart from that, usually we also look at infections, bacterial infections, fungal and viral infections, etc. This study was also conducted during COVID-19 pandemic while it was going on. So does IV secukinumab increase the risk of COVID infections compared to placebo? So those were some of the safety that we looked at. And interestingly, we didn't really find any new problems at all. And the exposure adjusted incidence rates seen in this particular trial were not very different. So in general, the number I throw around for IBD is 0.8. And I actually use these numbers in my daily practice. So when the patient has heard about something, I say that, if I treat, and patients have difficulty in understanding what is per 100 patient years. That's a difficult concept to get your hands around. I tell my patient that if I'm seeing 100 patients like you, over a year, less than one patient would get new IBD, inflammatory bowel disease. It's 0.8. And fungal infection is about 3% or etc. And none of the patients dropped out of the study because of fungal infections or any of these candida infections or other things. So there were minor things, headaches, nasopharyngitis, respiratory tract infection, etc. But there were no new safety signal. It was very well tolerated.
Great. And just parenthetically, it makes me feel so appreciative about our immune systems that there's so much redundancy and so much complexity that you can knock out a cytokine like IL-17 and only get superficial candidal infections rather than the more invasive ones. So
Absolutely. Yes.
neat. Your article has some really nice figures and tables, and obviously this is a podcast, so listeners can't see them. But Dr. Devdat, if you can help visualize it in their mind, what is the biggest kind of like takeaway from these primary and secondary endpoints in terms of, the big picture?
Yeah, so typically the figures show not only the difference between the placebo and the active drug. We have a figure there, figure 2, for those who haven't really looked at the journal. That's a line figure. So the line figure shows how quickly those lines go away from each other. So you start with placebo and active drug. And of course, it depends on how often you saw the patients. Here, the patients were seen every 4 weeks because they were coming in for infusions. So after a single infusion at week 0, the bars, when the patient came back at week 4 and they have only received 6 milligram per kilogram IV secukinumab or placebo, by week 4 already there is a separation of that bar graph. So you can imagine that kind of, and that remains from week 4, week 8, week 12, and week 16, of course, is the primary endpoint. So they kind of, the lines diverge from there. And then there is a jump because at week 16, the patients on placebo get 3 milligram per kilogram secukinumab, and then the patient comes back at week 20, and you suddenly find, the lines have come together. That placebo had jumped. So I'm kind of describing it to the visualizing for people to think how it is. And then those lines, they stay together, and it keeps on getting better and better, though that's open label extension, and observed as observed. So that's our primary endpoint, which is the SS40, and then the other are bar graphs, which kind of show the secondary endpoints. And these are typical bars of active drug versus placebo and how the difference is, and that visualization is always very important there.
Absolutely. One of the reasons why I wanted to think about the visualization in the big picture is, I was reading the discussion section and it's really fascinating. We talked about it just a little bit earlier, but what's the data and what are your insights about patient preferences for subcutaneous versions of immunomodulators versus the IV?
Yeah, that's interesting. And now we have done a completely different study and we have submitted that to EULAR. And now I'm suddenly wondering whether that did get accepted or we haven't even heard from EULAR or what happened. Anyhow, we did a separate study about patient preferences about these advanced therapies and what do they like? Do they like subcutaneous? Do they like IV? Do they like oral? Do they like once a day oral or twice a day oral or blah blah, all this kind of stuff? And that's a separate abstract that we have submitted, and this was a web-based survey of patients from European patients and US patients, large study. And we did this all this kind of fancy analysis there, something called best and worst scaling, and patients were given, it was well done, but of course I'm biased. In any case, patients generally prefer oral medication. That's point number one. Oh, another interesting thing is it depends on how the patient's status is at that time. In the sense, are they already receiving some fancy treatment and are they well controlled or not? If they're well controlled already, then they don't want to change and they say, this is great. This, whatever I'm getting is great. I don't want to make any difference. Whereas if the patients are not doing great, then they are more likely to change. No, no, this is not good. And then they are more likely to answer like, no, no, I want to go from this subcutaneous to IV because this subcutaneous is not good. In other words, their choices are based on how they are feeling at that time. So it's not a clear answer to your question, Bharat, as to what patients prefer. It depends on what state they. This is what we discovered in that separate study that we did. In any case, if you ask patients who are naive and they are not on any drugs, then they would generally prefer oral drugs first. It also depends on how often. So the frequency of the medication is important. The convenience is important. In general, patients prefer subcutaneous over IV because IV means going to. This is a in general a comment that I'm making. Patients, there are some patients, few patients who are very reluctant to give themselves injections, and this could be elderly and this could be having some other issues, and they would like to go to the hospital to receive IV. And just quickly, if I have patient that I'm really worried about their compliance, I switch them to IV because then actually I have control to see that they are really receiving. But to your answer to your question is oral is preferred, then subcutaneous, then IV in general.
So many questions come up in my mind. So number one is that I really hope that EULAR accepts your abstract. And I really want to read that article as well because it does get to the heart of rheumatology. And as you mentioned, it's not clear, but that's why we're rheumatologists. Otherwise, you could probably automate it in the same way this like IRT integrated response technology is. So, I mean, it's just really neat that we have another option on the table so that we can accommodate the preferences of our patients.
Yeah, yeah. There is one quick thing which I wanted to mention, and that is the dose that we used in this study was 6 milligram per kilogram bolus and then 3 milligram per kilogram every 4 weeks. However, the dose that is approved by the FDA is 1.75 milligram per kilogram, a dose that we never even tested in this study. Isn't that odd? Doesn't that make you feel bizarre? And I thought this was unbelievable that they would do this. So there is something called, and I just want to let our listeners know, there's something called MIDD, Model Informed Drug Development. This is a new way FDA approves drugs and they give a choice to pharmaceutical companies. And this 1.75 number comes from looking at our experience with Secukinumab. 150 milligram and 300 milligram are the two dosages which are already approved. And what FDA said was those dosages, even 300 milligram subcutaneous dose every 4 weeks, the pharmacokinetics shows us that the highest serum level is 1.75. Well, what it would be that serum level can be achieved by IV 1.75 milligram. per kilogram. And that's what we are going to approve, because even though you showed that it's safe, we don't know what's going to happen in long term. And FDA is extremely risk averse. And that's why, even though we have never tried this drug, the dose 1.75 milligram, that's the dose we are slapped with.
Hmm. That's interesting. It's also interesting because MIDD, mid, in brain rot slang means not so good. Well, in any case, I did want to mention too. So, this is again a fascinating study, fascinating article, but all studies, all articles, they have their limitations. So, what would you like our listeners to know before they make a judgment about IV secukinumab and Axpa? And we talked about
Yeah. And that's a great point. And I think the limitation is, I mean, that this drug works at 6 milligram per kilogram and 3 milligram per kilogram. Will it really work at 1.75? Only time will tell. It's not the study limitation. It's what is imposed upon us by the FDA. So try it and see whether 1.75 milligram works. I would have liked to have, we as rheumatologists, as doctors, we like to increase our dosages. If 15 milligram methotrexate doesn't work, we want to go to 20 milligram. I mean, if my subcutaneous 150 is not working, I go to 300 subcutaneous. If 300 doesn't work, I do want to go to 6 milligram per kilogram IV, but no, I don't have a choice. I'm slapped with this 1.75, which is unfortunate part. So only time will tell. So that's the big drawback of day-to-day practice rather than the clinical trial, where it actually seems to be working very well. We didn't, of course, another limitation is we didn't do IV this dose versus the subcutaneous dose to see whether one is better than the other.
right. Yeah, there's a difference between clinical trials and real world stuff. So, as you said, give it a try, see what happens. But speaking of clinical trials, the fact that this trial was called Invigorate 1 kind of, for me, means that there has to be an Invigorate 2 that's in the wings, right? I mean,
No, it is published. Haha. But
oh,
we are number one. So if you look, I want to, yeah, we are number one. And in the same issue of arthritis and rheumatism, February 2025, Invigorate 1 is published. And then the next page is Invigorate 2. And Invigorate 2 is psoriatic arthritis, IV secukinumab, and in psoriatic arthritis. So Invigorate 1 and Invigorate 2 were parallel trials, one in Axial SPA, one in PSA. But yes, we are number one.
and listeners, this should be a warning about using Google AI to search for results. Because when I looked for Invigorate, not only did I find nothing, which should have been on the next page, but also it sent me to some page about anime villains named Invigorate 2.
Yeah,
Anyways,
yeah, no, just turn the page
just turn
in
the
the
page.
journal and you'll see Invigorate 2 there.
So is there an Invigorate 3 then?
Not that I'm aware of. I don't know. No,
Maybe in the future. Maybe.
maybe. Yeah.
My final question. So the Google AI failed me in terms of my sleuthing, but when I was sleuthing it out just a little bit earlier, I saw that you have a very unique license plate that's posted up in your office. Can you tell us the story behind that?
Yeah. So for listeners, I got this number plate. It's the real number plate from Texas. It says HLA B27. So one of my first fellows, more than, well, nearly 25 years ago now, he knew my interest in axial spondyloarthritis, and he trained here at OHSU, Oregon Health and Science University, and moved to San Antonio. And he got a number plate in Texas, HLA B27. In Texas, you can only put one number plate, either on the front or the back, which feels very odd to me, but then it's Texas. What can I say? And so he put one on the front or back, and in the other one, he kept clean and pristine in his cupboard. And then I was invited to speak at the STAR, which is State of Texas Association of Rheumatology. Wonderful name for one star state. So that STAR, their annual meeting, I have been there a few times. And the first time when I went there, they gave me a bouquet of flowers after I spoke. And then they gave me this number plate, which was framed. And I was very pleasantly surprised. And then Everett Allen, I hope you're listening to this, Everett. He said, it's my number plate. And so he's still driving. There is a car being driven in San Antonio with that number plate. The other plate is here in my office.
Right. If I ever drive to Texas, then I'll know if I ever run into somebody with an HLA-B27 license plate who it is.
Yes.
Maybe there's a gout expert with HLA-B58. Maybe not 5801 out there. In any So I think, that was my last question that I had prepared for you. But, what else would you like to tell our listeners? What else should we know about Invigorate One or whatever else?
No, I think it's an exciting time to be in the Axial SPA space. The next big thing, which should be coming out very soon, is the classification criteria, the classic study that is completed, as I said, and we are looking forward to publishing. As I said, we have got two models, and one of them will be chosen finally by voting in the SAS and Spartan membership. But these will have better sensitivity, but more importantly, better specificity. Uh, we are never going to get diagnostic criteria. There are no diagnostic criteria in rheumatology. It's only always classification criteria, and that's a different story altogether. But these classification criteria would have much better specificity and, interestingly, even better sensitivity. And this is because of the big revolution that MRI has done in this space to diagnose patients correctly and early and more accurately, and etc. We still lack another biomarker outside of MRI and then CRP and HLA-B27. And Spartan is undertaking another study called BASIS for doing the biomarker. So lots of new interesting things happening in this field.
I swear you guys always come up with the best names for these studies. Invigorate, Basis, Classic, Measure 1, 2, all this kind of stuff. It's always fun. So that is all the time that we have for today. I am very, very, very deeply grateful for your time, Dr. Devther. And my thanks also goes out to all the researchers like Dr. Devther who challenge our nation and our world to better support those who are living with systemic autoimmune and rheumatic diseases. So thank you all for listening to this podcast. We will see you next time, or in Brain Rot. Thanks, Van, for vibing with the Skibbity Pod. Catch you on the flip side, King Rizzler.
Thank you. Thanks, Bharat. Thanks for this opportunity.
Absolutely. ACR Journals On Air is a production of the American College of Rheumatology. Please follow at ACR Room on social media. Email us at podcast@rheumatology.org and rate and subscribe to our podcast at acrjournalsonair.org or wherever you get your podcasts. Take care.